To prepare the sides for the binding cutter, you need to remove this little overhang edge that's left by when you use the router to trim it. There's a bunch of ways to do that. You can use scrapers, you can use sandpaper, you can even use a rolling pin type of device that's made for just doing this, but those get a little bit on the pricey side. The simplest tools to use, that I use at least, I use a half round file. I think this is just called a bastard file. It's a Nicholson. Anyways, it appears to be a double cut half round file. And you'll need one of these. This is a flexible backing pad for sanding. And it's sold by automotive suppliers. This happens to be made by Mirka. It's sometimes called a double density pad. And what we're gonna use this for is we're gonna attach some sticky back sandpaper to this, and we're gonna use it to conform to the side a bit so that we fair that curve, which is the term that's called when you do that, you're fairing that curve. And what that does is that removes any little inconsistencies in just the smoothness of that curve. Now, as I said before, everything that you do in guitar making depends on the previous step. So I spent a lot of time setting up my bending machine and getting the temperature and blankets and everything right so that I don't have things like ripples and problems with the sides as they came out of the bender. But notwithstanding that, you do have to smooth out the sides for the binding job, even whether you've done a really good bending job or you've done sort of a not so good bending job. But the first step is to use a file to remove this little overhang here. And when you use a file, don't go like this, meaning don't come from the inside and push the file out. Because what that can do, particularly on the spruce, is if it catches an edge, you'll tear off a piece. So when you file this little overhang off, always come from the outside in. See? Like this. So what I'll do is I'll file that little edge around the entire perimeter of the guitar on both the top and the back, and then I'll show you how to fair it before we start the binding. You use the half round so that you can get into the waist here. This actually goes pretty quick, assuming that your binding or when you did the trimming with the binding router, you cut pretty close to the edge. One of the reasons I use the file is because when you have a really hard wood like maple, you'll spend a lot longer with sandpaper or a scraper than using a file. One of the things to remember when you're doing something like this, which is removing this hard edge on here, and even further when we start fairing, is always learn when you're doing this to trust your hands and not your eyes. Your eyes won't show you really minor imperfections, but your sense of touch and your sense of feel is much more of a powerful tool to sense imperfections and problems. So you'll see me as I do this is that I'll constantly use my fingers. Like right there, I have an edge that I didn't get with the file. Right here, I've got a glue spot or something like that, which is easy to feel. And then here in the waist, I've got some problems. So, tip, always trust your fingers and your sense of touch before you touch your eyes, particularly when sanding and doing something like this. Now that I've got those edges removed with the file on the top and the back, rather, top and the back, I'm now gonna sand the sides smooth. Now, you can use a lot of different tools for this. You can use, as I mentioned before, you can use a scraper if you want. But what I prefer to do is I prefer to use sandpaper and some sort of a backing pad that will be flexible enough to conform to the curve. You could also use a piece of spring steel, which I know that some guitar makers use. I just find these pads, which you can find just about anywhere, a lot easier to use. And what I'm doing is I'm applying sticky back 120 grit sandpaper. Now, the goal of this is just to make this smooth, or to ferret, so that the binding cutter will have a perfect surface, or perfect curve to ride on when it cuts the channel. This is not surface preparation sanding, meaning you're removing scratch marks and all that. You don't want to remove a lot of wood at this point. You'll do that later. So I'm going to use 120 grit paper rather than maybe 100 or even 80. And I'm just going to go light. Once again, my goal here is to just fair that curve. So what I'll do is I'll just press down on the block like that, and sand. Now, if you want, you can take a pencil or a piece of chalk and just make some lines like this to let you know that you've removed that wood. But basically, you really want to just concentrate on the area that the binding bearing is gonna, or the binding cutter bearing is gonna ride on. So I'm just gonna pretty much concentrate on the edges. But once again, notice how I'm conforming the block to the curve. When I get to here, which is just flat, I'll just relax the pad, or relax the block. And once again, I'm feeling with my fingers. You'll see that there's a fair amount of glue right there, which is from when I glued the sides together, or when I glued the tail block in, but I'm not gonna worry about that because it feels smooth. We'll remove that later on when we do surface preparation. And P.S., it probably would be a good idea to wear a mask at this point because I'm not working with a downdraft table or a vacuum. So I'm gonna cut and go put on a mask. Just in case you're wondering, I really like these dual purpose masks. This is the mask I wear in the finishing room when I'm spraying, but they have pre-filters, which are P95 rated, which is the same rating as the dust masks that you wear. And the dust masks that have the little strap on the back that, you know, are used for pandemic purposes these days, they're a very poor fit. These are a much better fit and work a lot better. Now notice how I'm just pushing. If you do a lot of cutaways, like what I do, it would make sense to take one of these blocks, the bigger ones, and cut it in half, and it makes it easier to get into that curve. Check finally, what I'll do is I'll take the bigger block and then I'll go back and forth around the entire perimeter of the guitar like that. And you'll actually feel that edge a little bit as you hit it with the block. So you gotta do a little bit more work with this. But I'll go around the whole guitar and make sure that that edge is gone and my sides are smooth and faired, at least for the binding cutter bearing to ride on. Another really good tool to have in your arsenal, if you do a lot of work with cutaways or anything that's curved, are these curved, flexible sanding blocks. You can find these on Amazon and other places. I think Klingspor sells them, whatever. But anyways, you can shape these to just about any curve that you want, and they're perfect for getting in cutaways. Now notice how I'm going back and forth against the grain. I want to make sure I've got that edge of that top and that back flush. And that's all it takes with one of these. The very last thing I'm going to do before I get out the binding jig is I have to establish this ramp for the fretboard extension. And this is a very specific angle, and it's calculated into the geometry when I built the sides. But I may need to finesse it a little bit. And the purpose of this is to make sure that when the neck is attached to the guitar, the fretboard lays flat on the top of the guitar, and you have the right angle, or a straight edge when placed across the frets will just graze the top of the bridge. So what I do is I make a mock 3/8 inch piece of wood here at the bridge location to simulate the height of the bridge. And I've got a jig here. This is a adaptation of a Charles Fox jig. And all this is just a piece of mahogany. And what I've got here is I've got a piece of 120 grit sandpaper mounted to a riser plate, which is the width of the fretboard, the thickness of the fretboard, plus the height of the frets when the fretboard has frets installed. So in my case, this is about 0.30, and that will give me the height of, or the thickness of the fretboard, which is about 1/4 inch, plus the height of the frets. So I just made some pencil marks here. I'll just sand this and see where I am. The reason I'm doing this now is because I don't want to do it after the binding is installed, in case you have to remove a fair amount of wood from the top, and then that will make your bindings in that area thinner than the rest of the guitar. So I've sanded away the pencil marks I made on the ramp here, the ramp on the soundboard for the fretboard extension with my Charles Fox type jig. Now I'll check it. This is the fretboard that I've made for this guitar, and this guitar actually is going to a Major League Baseball player. So we've inlaid some gold mother of pearl special meaning items on the fretboard. All gold mother of pearl, and we have gold mother of pearl side dots too. So we will take and put it at the 14th fret. Take a straight edge. And I'm coming down about, I want to say a millimeter and a half from the top of that bridge. So once the frets are installed, which will add, in this case, they're 0.43, they're Evo Gold, I'll have enough height so that I'll just graze the top of the bridge when the fretboard is installed, which is what you want. Actually, in reality, when the guitar is made and the action is set and I'm doing the final intonation, I want the actual fretboard, or the when a straight edge is put on the frets, I want it to come above the bridge by about a millimeter or so. And the reason I do that is so that I have enough height in the saddle to do intonation adjustments. If this particular player wants very low action, I'll have enough room and I don't get too low a saddle. So this is all part of building some of this pre-planning into your build at this point so that you don't have to hassle with it later and waste a lot of time. The final thing I do before I get out my binding channel jig is give this area another coat of shellac, because once again, if you put some of the binding tape on bare spruce, you're going to pull out fibers. The shellac really, really helps this out.